and we were hit repeatedly. I got a machine gun slug in my hip and one that went through my right leg, and it is strange what flits through one's mind in these circumstances. I remember vowing that the next time that I went, I would have some armor plate on that seat. I didn't wish to end the war as a eunuch with a falsetto voice. As usual, navigation was not so good. We wandered around Holland for about 20 minutes trying to find the target. And while following a canal, two of our planes collided and crashed. Another one landed in the canal. And Stillman's ship flipped over a pancake on its back in the canal, and miraculously, he suffered only some broken ribs and a fractured little finger. Our flight leader's right engine was on fire, and although his and our ship were the only two to bomb the target, I lost sight of him with his plane streaming fire and smoke. And one of our engines also was on fire. I turned to pull the fire extinguisher cable, the handle of which was clipped on the floor behind the co-pilot's seat, and I had to unhook my safety belt to reach it. And that is probably what saved my life, because I did not take the time to refasten the belt before we ditched. The extinguisher was not functioning, and it had no effect on the fire. And as we crossed the coast, our other engine was hit and was on fire, and it became evident that we would have to ditch immediately. I flipped open the overhead hatches, and almost simultaneously we hit the water at about 200 miles per hour. The next thing I remember is regaining consciousness underwater in a panic. My right leg was caught in some part of the plane, but I kicked frantically and fortunately broke loose, surfacing with neither plane nor any other member of my crew in sight. I pulled the inflating plugs to my Mae West, trying to regain my senses. And in those frantic moments, I was paralyzed with fear that I was going to drown. And on reflection, really felt shame when I remembered how many times I had boasted while I was in college that I had no fear of death until I actually met it. I did not suffer any very serious injuries other than the gunshot wounds. My right collarbone was fractured, my nose was smashed, and I had severe lacerations on the head. But the salt water managed to act as a cauterizing agent, stopping the bleeding. In addition, I used the morphine needle from my survival kit, and it filled me with a sense of euphoria, which crowded out the depression I felt over the loss of my crew. Many times after that, as many others have done, I wondered about the irony of fortuitous circumstances which decreed that I should live, and my crewmates, who were as good if not better than I, should die. I could see German patrol boats in the distance, and about then I was praying to be captured. The icy temperatures of the North Sea did not tolerate long life, and we had police whistles tied to our Mae West, and I assure you that I gave mine a real workout trying to attract the attention of the patrol boats. Fortunately, one of them pulled alongside me, and one of the German sailors pulled me aboard. They laid me out on the deck, cut away the clothing from my right leg, bandaged it, gave me a shot of brandy, and covered me with a blanket, telling me, "For you, the war is over." Several hours later, we docked at Amsterdam, were taken to its municipal hospital, in which we received the same treatment that German aircrew were receiving at the time. Several hours later, we docked at Amsterdam, were taken to its municipal hospital, and despite the fact that the entire group had been shot down, 1/3 survived, and I thought that was a real miracle. We were all put in the same hospital bay and were there about a week, and then shipped in Red Cross hospital rail cars to Frankfurt on the Main. and upon arrival I was transported to another hospital called Homart in the outskirts of Frankfurt, operated by evangelical nuns. The hospital was an interrogation center, and that is where I was subjected to my first interrogation by a German officer. We were instructed to give only name, rank, and serial number if captured. We were never really trained in how to deal with these interrogators. In any event, the only way I was able to handle mine, a first lieutenant, was to ask him what he would do if he'd been captured. And I asked him if he would give any information. Of course, he said, absolutely not. You wouldn't get anything out of me. Well, I was such small fry that in short order he stopped coming by. During the period of interrogation, I was kept in a room with padded walls, which led me to believe that it had been an insane asylum. The windows were shuttered and there was no light. And I remembered then Oscar Wilde's description of his incarceration, quote, when each day is a year, and a year whose days are long. About 3 weeks later, I was taken to WWII in the outskirts of Frankfurt. This was a prisoner of war dispersal center, and a few days later we were placed in boxcars and transported to the famous Stalag Luft 3 in Sagen, Silesia, in eastern Germany, which is now Poland. Most of the Air Force officer prisoners were interned in that camp, and it was situated in the middle of a pine forest in the outskirts of Sagan's railroad marshalling yard, and there's a photograph up here which shows it. I cannot really describe to you the terrible feeling of claustrophobia which engulfed me when the gates of the camp closed behind me. As we all know, the loss of liberty is one of the most serious injuries that can be inflicted upon an individual, but unfortunately its true import cannot be understood without having personally experienced it. For that reason, most of us take it for granted. Freedom of locomotion, freedom to go where you please without having to account for it to anyone, except maybe your wife, is one of our most precious freedoms, one whose value is not realized until it is taken away. I vowed then that somehow I was going to get out of that camp, and it took me almost 2 years to do so. A few days later, my leg became badly infected, and I was taken to the camp infirmary staffed by British doctors. There I met another patient, a British squadron leader, who had been shot down during a reconnaissance mission over Kiel on the day before the war started in 1939. He'd been there some 4 years already. He had been a manufacturer's representative in Berlin before the war and spoke fluent German. And the first year of his activity gave him an opportunity to escape. He had civilian clothes, spoke fluent German, and had the appropriate passes. But something about him alerted some Hitler Jugend while he was on a train to the Baltic, hoping to catch a freighter to Sweden. He was stopped, questioned, and his identity was discovered. He said he made 2 other unsuccessful attempts. And this situation was so discouraging that I almost resigned myself to being a prisoner for the duration. But not quite. Stalag Luft 3, as I said before, was in the middle of a pine forest on sandy soil. When I arrived, there were only 3 separate compounds, called the East, Middle, and North. The few Americans, including me, then captured, were billeted with the British in the North compound. Because of the anticipated influx of Americans, the Germans were building a new compound known as the South, adjacent to the British North, to house the Americans. By the end of the war, there were many more compounds constructed to house the more than 10,000 aircrew officers in that camp. The camp, as you see from these sketches,